All right. Well, today on the show, we're excited to talk to Lamar Hardwick. Lamar, how are you today?
I'm doing well. Thanks for having me.
Absolutely. So, Lamar, you just released a book called Disability in the Church, and you have
Mhm.
a just a fascinating story. I would love for you to share a little bit of your story for our listeners, and even maybe what led you to write the book.
Just a little bit about me. If any of your listeners have never heard my story, I'm largely known online as the Autism Pastor. Um, and that is because, uh, well, a couple of reasons. In 2014, I was actually, as an adult, I was 36 at the time, diagnosed on the autism spectrum. Um, that came after years of silently struggling with a lot of issues that I didn't have a label or a language to describe. Um, so I knew probably as early as the age of 7 or 8 that there were some differences, significant differences between me and my peers, other children my age. But at that time, I had language, I could speak very well, and I was doing okay in school, but I had a lot of social struggles.
Mhm.
Um, and and then also, I was born in '78, so there wasn't as much knowledge about autism and what it is and what it isn't. And so I grew up in the school of boys develop slower than girls, and he'll be fine. So a lot of things that were probably would have had me diagnosed at a proper age now were things that we just didn't consider when I was growing up. I also grew up in a military family, so we moved quite a bit, just about every 3 years. And so when I was finally diagnosed as an adult, my therapist believes that that had a significant role in why I wasn't diagnosed, is because I moved every 3 years. And part of that time was spent living overseas in a different country, different language. And so there are a lot of things that sort of masked what would have got me a diagnosis much earlier. So, needless to say, I sort of struggled through life with a lot of things. I pretended to understand a lot of things that I didn't really understand. The best description I could give is it felt like the world was in on an inside joke that I didn't understand. And so I just pretended to understand. So in 2013 or end of 2012, I was being considered to step into the senior pastor role at a church I was serving with at the time. And in that process, I had to spend more time preaching and teaching in the adult service. At the time, I was a youth pastor. And I like to joke that, all teenagers are socially awkward. So nobody really noticed that I was socially awkward. I just fit in with the teenagers. But when I spent more time around the adults, I started hearing just observations of people's social interaction with me, such as he walked past me, he didn't speak, he looks unapproachable. People thought I was always angry. My facial expressions, my body language made it appear that I was not someone who was very social. And those are all things that I knew that I would never do intentionally. Um, but I realized that I have been hearing that my whole life. And so eventually, after doing some research and having one of the staff members do an evaluation of me that almost literally read like diagnostic criteria, he said, Lamar has a hard time picking up on social cues. Lamar gets laser focused on one task at a time. And in his evaluation of me, it literally led like a diagnostic criteria. And so honestly, at that time, I didn't know what a social cue was, never heard of it. So I Googled it, like most people, when you don't understand what something is.
Hmm.
And that led me to start to see all of these connections that I wasn't making until I finally read the definition of what I was diagnosed with, is just Asperger's, which is the autism spectrum disorder. It finally made sense, and I did investigation on my own for about a year until I got up the courage to asked my wife to help me to find someone to diagnose me, because at that point I was pretty sure that this is what people had been saying about me my entire life. So fast forward, after being diagnosed, I really started to understand things differently, about my relationship with the church, why it was so difficult for so many years. Even though I was in ministry, I had a really hard time. Had been to several churches and never just could never settle, never could fit in, always felt on the outside. That helped explain a lot. And so through that journey, it opened my eyes as I entered into what I call the disability community. And I understood why I had so many struggles and what some of those barriers were. And so that sort of birthed this passion to try to bridge the gap. There are many people like myself, whether it's intellectual, developmental, or physical disabilities, that have always felt on the outside of the church, and have struggled to become truly included as a part of the church. And so that led me to write a book about what that looks like if the church really starts to look at why a large segment of the disability community is not active in their local churches. So the books is a culmination of my own experience, but also research and study and talking to, hundreds of people who also have had the same struggles I've had.
Yeah. Lamar, when you received that diagnosis, you said you were 36, you were already a pastor.
Mhm.
What happened to your ministry? How did that change your ministry, affect your church, and that sort of thing?
Yeah, so surprisingly, I, I was diagnosed in the end of 2014. I made a very, which I was told, a courageous decision to disclose that diagnosis in March 2015. But honestly, I didn't know that. I thought of it as courageous at the time. I thought of it as, I really don't want anyone to come to this church and have a bad experience with me that I'm not aware of, because
Mm.
that tended to happen a lot with me socially. I would think that was having a great conversation with someone, but apparently my body language and facial expressions were not communicating that to people. And the church was growing, because people tended to like my preaching and my teaching. It was just the social part that I struggled with. And so they would see me on stage and not have this interaction that they assumed they would have, based on what they saw on stage. And so I disclosed because honestly, I just didn't want anyone to leave the church because they thought I was a jerk. Because there are things that are often out of my control, and the thing about it is, I know that it happens. I just don't always know when it's happening, and oftentimes you don't get a second chance with people. So that's why I disclosed it from the stage. I preached a series, called "I Am Strong," and the very first message of that, I did a video testimony about me being diagnosed. And to my surprise, people cheered. They clapped. It took about 3 minutes after the video for me to start the sermon because so many people were applauding. And I think it was because it sort of gave everyone an opportunity to exhale and say, look, I get it. I have someone in my family who's on the spectrum. I have someone, my child, or so there are a lot of people who I think it gave them permission to, quote unquote, come out of hiding with things that they had been struggling with, or a family member. So it changed my ministry because that moment sort of, solidified what I felt like was going to be a calling to try to bridge the gap and to also start to destigmatize topics in the church that we don't talk about, such as disability and mental health. And so it was a great moment to bring clarity to what my ministry is, not just inside the walls of the church, but outside the walls of the church.
Yeah. And since that moment, have you seen that happen in your church? That breaking down those walls, you're able to talk about those things, and all of those things that you just felt this was a call to. Have you seen kind of the fruit of that in this past couple of years?
Absolutely. One of the things that, we started to see happen, was a lot more families started to feel comfortable, coming to church, knowing that there was a place where they weren't going to be judged.
Wow.
Because it's one thing for the church to say we welcome everyone. It's a whole other thing for the pastor to openly say, I have a developmental disability. And this is some of the ways that I struggle. This is some of the reasons why I can't do things the way that a quote unquote typical pastor would do. But it gave people the freedom to stop hiding, as I talk about in the book, to stop hiding behind the figurative fig leaves covering ourselves, and to just be okay with being human. Um, and so, yeah, there was an influx of families, but also it opened up my ministry to the world, because I started to have people contacting me via social media, and that's where actually the title autism pastor came from. It wasn't something that I actually came up with. It was a woman years ago who said that we don't go to church, we can't get to church. I also had a lot of people in the autism and disability community who weren't Christians, but they saw me as their only source of spiritual care. And so I actually had a woman who coined that phrase, that autism pastor. And so I changed all my social media handles to reflect that, because it just made it easier for people who were looking for me to find me. And so it became something that was not just about the church I was pastoring, but about a whole community of people who felt ostracized by the church, who needed someone to look to for spiritual guidance. So it definitely changed a lot about my ministry from a local to more of a outside the walls, and gave me an opportunity to be sort of a missionary to that community who was not receiving any kind of spiritual care at all.
Yeah. What a beautiful story. And just to see how God has and is using that. In the book, you talk a lot about diversity and
Mhm.
inclusion. And in the book, you talk about how disability is a part of that. You don't really hear that a lot. When you hear discussions about diversity and inclusion, you don't hear a lot of talk about disability. And so I would love for you, if you could, just to paint a picture of biblical diversity and how disability is a part of that.
Yeah, so the subtitle of the book is a vision for diversity and inclusion, and it's because our culture over the last several years has been pushing all sorts of organizations, not just the church, to consider voices that have been historically left out of the conversation. And so most of that has been racial and ethnic, and there's definitely a need for that. But what I discovered is that if diversity is starting to look at how we can bring a variety of voices to the table that have historically not had a voice, then we also have to start by saying and understanding that the largest minority group in the world is people with disabilities. About 19 or 20% of the population has some form of a disability, be it intellectual, developmental, or physical. And so, what I thought is that if we're going to have that conversation about being more diverse, certainly ethnically and racially is important, but the largest minority group in the world is actually persons with disabilities, about 1 in 5. And so I think the discussion of diversity needs to start at a larger perspective, is that there's a group that has mostly been marginalized, not just from the church, but other institutions and organizations, that needs to have a voice at the table. And I also say in the book that the disability community is the only minority group that anyone can join at any time for any reason.
Mm.
You can be born with a disability, or you could have some sort of accident or medical issue that causes you to become a part of the disability community. So, for me, if we start by talking about that population as we talk about diversity, I think it helps us to become better at the ethnic and racial diversity that we're seeking. So, what you see in the Bible is, whether it's looking at Luke 14, the parable of the banquet, where Jesus talks about when you invite people, start with the blind, the lame, the crippled, and the poor, these marginalized communities. Um, you see Jesus' ministry here. He's oftentimes going after that specific community as a way of bringing them back into the community, because many of them had been ostracized, had been pushed out onto the margins of community. And so for Jesus' ministry, a lot of that diversity meant bringing them back into the community, giving them a place in God's kingdom where they had historically been left out of that. And so if you sort of follow the trajectory biblically of diversity, it is raising up and bringing in those marginalized voices, but it's also having a respect for the individuality that God created people to have. And so diversity is not trying to just get a bunch of people together. It's also allowing them to keep the individuality and the image of God in them intact without having to be somebody else. Because you really don't have diversity unless everybody's allowed to be themselves. And then we're allowed to get along and to be in unity. And so, so it's a little bit different of a concept from what our culture teaches us. But I think if you study the Bible, even in Revelation, when John paints the picture of heaven, he says, around the throne, worshiping are every tribe, nation, and tongue. So it got me thinking that, wow, if that stays intact in heaven, and how come we can't do the same thing here? Every single part of God's human creation is allowed to be in his presence and worship together. And then even if you look at what I call the opening day of the church in Acts, where Peter quotes from Joel, he says, "The Spirit of the Lord, he is come so that the sons and daughters can prophesy and all." If you break it down, he says that basically there are every generation, every gender, every condition, every culture. And that's declared on the opening day of the church, that this is what you're experiencing, is that God is bringing all these together, every generation, every gender, every condition, every culture. And that gives us sort of a great idea of what diversity is and what the church's role is in diversity. On the opening day of the church, Peter preaches that sermon that says this is what God's Spirit is doing. He's bringing together all these groups, and he's going to form a new people. And the church is at the forefront of bringing that message to the world.
Yeah. What do you think it is that, because as I was reading your book, I definitely, I'm sure it's probably out there, but I can't think of another book like it that talks about this subject. Why do you think that the church has either been silent or just doesn't know, really have the language to talk about this issue of like you say in the book, and you just now referenced, inviting the disability community to the table, and not just to the table, but giving them significant seats at the table. Why do you think
Right.
that the church just seems to be silent about this issue?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think a large part of it is we weren't really taught to focus on that.
Mm.
One of the goals of the book is I wanted to make it accessible for everyone to read, but I also wanted to make it academically and theologically sound enough where pastors are interested in this topic. And so, I break down a lot of scriptures and talk about a lot of things. What I found is, as I've done conferences over the last couple of years, disability ministry conferences, there are always great people who come from local churches who have a passion, primarily because they probably have someone in their family who's impacted by disability. But I very rarely run into pastors or leaders of the church. And what that said to me is, as a pastor, I know this. Almost nothing happens in a local church that's not important to the pastor and leaders of the church. And if the pastors and the leaders are not equipped or educated, then you're going to find the church being silent about this issue because they just weren't ever taught. For a fact, when I did my master's and my doctorate, we never covered this. There are things that are core parts of the curriculum. You do your master's of divinity, you have to have church history, you have to have Bible, Old and New Testament, you have to have pastoral care, and you have to have some kind of preaching class. Those are usually the four main areas that you have to. Nowhere in any of that do we ever discuss disability. And so I think a large part of it is we're not training and equipping the people who are leading our churches to have enough knowledge about how to handle this, what the church's role is. So that tends to lend to a deafening silence. Um, and so one of my goals is to try to equip pastors and even equip the next generation of leaders to understand this is a very important issue. It's all over the text, but nobody ever, I certainly was never taught about that. And I think that's a part of the reason why the church is silent on it. We don't know. We're ignorant about it. I don't say that in a negative sense. We simply just don't know.
Yeah. Oh yeah. I'm definitely in the same boat. I never any training, seminary, anything like that. It just wasn't never brought up. Never
Mm-hmm.
brought to
Yeah.
anybody's attention. Is that one of the
Yeah.
reasons that
It's
in the book?
unfortunate, but that,
No, go ahead. You go ahead. Yeah.
yeah, I was just say it's unfortunate, but I think it's a reality that we're just not taught.
Yeah. Is that one of the reasons why in the book you spend so much time talking about the image of God and how we need
Mm-hmm.
to get back and get rooted into this idea? Because I definitely think that's one of the things that just with in the past year, 2020 and everything that's happened, it just seems that the church is deficient in an understanding of that all humanity is made in the image of God. Is that one of that lack of
Yeah.
teaching? Is that why you spend so much time on that in the book?
Yeah, absolutely. It's one of the things that I think we know about with sort of a head knowledge.
Mhm.
Um, we're taught that that's one of the core principles of our Christian faith, but we're not always great at it in practice. And so talking about it a lot in the book is exposing us to where the gaps between what we say we believe and how we practice it actually happens. And it's often exposed in how we have handled our relationship to the disability community. Um, because there's still very much stigma in the church about it. We don't like to talk about it. It makes us very uncomfortable. We have an adversarial relationship with suffering. We have an adversarial relationship with, um, I even talk about in the book, with even with our bodies, if they're not quote unquote typical. And so where does all that come from? Why do we struggle so much with that? I think we haven't really spent time to say, okay, if we're created in God's image, that means all of us, all genders, generations, cultures, and conditions bear the image of God. Why is it that we have such a hard time seeing that in people whose bodies function differently than ours? And so we have to wrestle with that. We have to acknowledge that maybe we haven't been seeing things the right way. Sort of in John chapter 9, where I talk about in the book, where the disciples asked Jesus, who sinned, this man or his parents, the man born blind, which is a ridiculous question. How much could an infant have sinned to cause blindness? Right? He just got here. What could he have done so wrong that God would have made him blind? Right? But
Mm.
Jesus changes the question. Right? He says, and I'm paraphrasing. This is sort of my interpretation on it. When he says that neither, it's so that the glory of God may be seen. So Jesus changes the question from why can't this man see to how can God be seen in him? And that's the question that I think we've neglected to ask, because oftentimes as a church, we're very conscious of causes of disability, and we're ultra conscious of possible cures for any kind of disability. But Jesus's ministry teaches us how to live in that in-between space between what caused this and what could possibly cure it. Jesus is focused on, no, let's see how we can respect and affirm the image of God in all humanity, despite how their body functions. So it starts for me with affirming the image of God in all of humanity.
Yeah. And I like how you said that in there. You know, a lot of people would affirm that. I mean, most Christians would affirm, oh, everybody's made in the image of God. But in your book, you give some practical ways that if we really believe that, that's going to work itself out in our churches. in
Hmm.
our lives. Can you just and I think you just now did, even to affirm the dignity of the person. But can you give some practical ways, maybe one or two, of I believe everybody is made in the image of God, and how what are some practical ways this plays out in our churches?
Yeah, so I think if we're talking about kind of exposing the ways where there's some gaps between what we say and what we believe
Yeah, yeah.
is the one of our favorite stories, the parable of the lost sheep, right? So Jesus tells, and I talk about in the book, Jesus tells a story of a guy who has a bunch of sheep. And we know the story. He realizes that one is missing and he goes after that one, which signifies God has this affinity for lost things, for things that are missing. And so I talk about in the book that really kind of helps to expose what our mission should be. Who's missing? It,
Mm,
because when we look around and say, okay, who's missing from our churches, that becomes the mission for the church, is to go after those who are missing. So if you just look statistically, um, if 1 out of 5 persons in our community uh, have a disability and our church doesn't reflect those numbers, at least on a bare minimum level, then we can say that the disability community is largely missing from our churches,
mm,
which exposes the fact that we have had very little to any focus on that community and very little to any focus on affirming them being image bearers of God. And so we really have to ask ourselves the question, why aren't they here? Um, and if they're not, why haven't we even thought about why they're here?
wow.
And that sort of exposes what we really believe about the importance of having them at the table. So I would say practically, what that looks like is run the numbers in your community. Um, Here's what I've discovered. You can just even look at the local school system. And of course, I'm just talking about school age children, not even adults. And you can see that there's a large number of children and teenagers in our local school system that have IEPs, individual education plans, because they have some sort of disability. So we know that they're living in our communities. We know that they're in our school systems. We know that they're right around the corner, and yet they are almost invisible when it comes to the church. And
Mm,
so I would encourage churches to start there, and you'll be shocked at how many people are right around the corner from our church. And a large portion, I would say somewhere between 80 to 90% of those families are probably not going to anyone's church in that community, which says a lot, especially in the day and age where it's a church on every corner.
yeah.
And you have this large population that most of them are not. And so that practical exercise will help you to see to pull the veil back and stop making that community invisible, because they're not invisible to our schools. They're not invisible to other organizations that are doing the work to support these families. And I tell churches, we are the most underutilized resource for families who already have a tremendous struggle. And it's not because they don't want to be a part of the church, it's because the church has not always been accessible to them. Not just the physical building, but accessible to them, theologically accessible, to the community, to be able to be not just invited, but included. But do that exercise, find out how many students, and that's just kids. We're not even talking about adults, and the elderly. And here's the other thing that I say, to churches and pastors. We also have to realize that if we live long enough, all of us are going to be a part of this community
Mm,
at some point.
yeah.
So it has to be a personal issue. It has to be something that we take seriously, because again, you can join that community at any time. And if you live long enough, you will be. And the other thing is, I tell people, if we have to utilize any sort of assistance, with how our body functions, then you're already in that community, whether you realize it or not, whether it's corrective lenses, blood pressure medication, walking assistance. You're already a part of that community, whether you realize it or not. So it's got to become something that is more personal for us as a church.
Hmm. Yeah. And so I wonder if you have any ideas, and obviously every church is different, context is
Mhm.
different, but that's a powerful exercise there to run the numbers. Who's missing? We run
Mhm.
the numbers, and like you said, the so many in the disability community, they're missing from our churches, and so
Right.
we see that. Is there a next step? What do you think? What do you think comes after that? So a church, their eyes are opened. Oh my goodness, they're not here. And
Mm.
what do you think the next step might be?
A great next step that I took in my former church and even my current church, although COVID has sort of changed things a lot on how we do church. But I also think it's a good thing, and I'll get to that in a second. But a great next step was when I did disclose, and I talked about how it started to chip away at the shame and the stigma, and then people who are already in our church who had some sort of disability or even a mental health issue felt more comfortable talking about it. What that showed me was is that there are already people who are either in our congregations or on the periphery of our congregations, loosely connected, who are part of this community, but they have not felt the freedom to disclose that.
Mm.
When I disclosed, it gave everyone the freedom to say, I in my former church, when I disclosed, I found out that I had staff members that had a disability that I didn't know of. I had a staff member that had lupus. I had a staff member that had an anxiety disorder, a staff member that had severe OCD, all things that I was not even aware of. But when I said, this is what I'm dealing with, it gave them the freedom. I say that to say that a great next step is start with the people that are probably already in a congregation, who are part of the disability community, who have been too shamed to talk about it. And those are going to be the great voices that you can bring to the table and say, okay, now that we know this, how do we shape our church in a way that becomes more inclusive of people who are dealing with some of the issues that you're dealing with? Because then we started to find out in our church, that's the reason why we only see this family every 8 to 10 weeks. It's not because they don't want to be there, it's they have a significant struggle that they've been doing all by themselves. And so while we're fussing at people not attending every week, some of those people are not attending every week because they fight all week to just try to get to church, and they fought again for doctor's appointments and medication and IEPs. And so by the time it comes to Sunday, they don't have enough left to come to church, but they want to. And they've been fighting that battle by themselves. And so giving them the freedom to speak up, but also giving them the freedom to help shape what the church should look like. Because you already, I encourage churches, you already have people in your congregation who are on the periphery of your congregation who are part of the disability community. Give them a voice, bring them into leadership, and have them help shape the church. A great example of this, if I can just share this, um, I have social anxiety. I've gotten better with it. But a lot of churches will do something in their church called Pass the Peace or meet and greet time during the service where they encourage everyone to walk around and hug each other. I did a straw poll a couple years ago and found out that about 80% of the people who come late to church were coming late because they wanted to miss that part of the service. And they
Yeah,
wanted to miss that part of the service because they had social anxiety like me. It made them nervous. Some of them had OCD. They didn't like to be touched. It's like, I want to be at church, but I don't want to be forced to do something that makes me extremely uncomfortable. And
yeah.
the large part of the time it was, and so, again, we're fussing at people like, why are you coming late every week? And they intentionally were doing it because we had created a part of the service that unintentionally was a barrier for people who had certain types of disabilities.
Hmm.
So we said, okay, we can create that sort of family atmosphere without excluding people who, for them, that is a huge barrier. So honestly, we got rid of it. I told the church we're not going to do that anymore because it's anxiety provoking for a lot of people. And instead of fussing at them for being late, why put up a barrier? So we'll create a cafe, and the people who need that sort of touch can congregate at the cafe over the coffee, and those who that's a barrier for don't have to. It's one thing to say we want to be a loving church, and hugs and all that is needed, but to make it an official part of the service where you must do this, um, it was like, wow, people, that's why they're not here,
Yeah.
because them do something that actually works against their disability. So that's just one example of, we just had to change the way that we did church so that we weren't putting up unintentional barriers for people who that was a problem for.
Yeah.
And to be okay with it, and to say to the people who need that, you can still hug as many people as you want. We're just not going to stop the service and make everybody in the audience do something that 20% of the people are just not comfortable with. So that's just one example of just changing the way that we do things. And then also think about sound and lighting and those types of things for persons like myself who have sensory processing. Sometimes it can be too loud, it can move too fast. Executive functioning challenges like I have, is a great way to overcome that is to help people understand what's going to happen in the service, so it doesn't provide anxiety. And so those are ways of just helping with some of the invisible disabilities, but there are all sorts of ways to restructure your church to make sure you're not putting up unintentional barriers.
Yeah. Those are powerful examples. Is that connected to what you talk about in the book when you say that our churches have been built backwards?
Yeah, absolutely. So that concept is a bigger one, but those are examples of how we build it backwards. So in that same parable of the banquet, when Jesus says, at that banquet, he tells a story of a banquet, and he
Hmm.
says that a servant goes out, sends out invitations. The first group, guest list, declines. Then he says, go out and invite the disability community, the lame, the blind, the poor, the cripple. And the servant does that, and he comes back and says, there's still room for more. And what I contend in the book is that when we start with that group, there's always room for everything else that you want to do in your church. Part of the reason why it's so hard to fit it in, I have so many pastor friends, disability almost never comes up in our conversations about ministry, about evangelism, about theology. Even when I talk to people in conferences that I've spoken at, and they're so passionate, but they're like, we can't get resources, we can't get volunteers, the pastor won't talk about it. And I tell them it's because we built it backwards. Anytime we start opposite of the group that Jesus tells us to start with, it's always going to be hard to fit the disability community into our vision, our mission, our planning, our budget. But if you start with them in mind, then there's always room to do everything else that you want to do in your church. And so starting with them in mind also means when we're crafting our worship services and when we're crafting programs or mission trips, are we making sure that we're not unintentionally excluding them from being able to participate in the full life of the church? They should have as much access to the mission and vision of your church as everyone else. But if you're setting up mission trips that are not disability friendly, if you're setting up small groups that are not friendly to that population, if you're setting up, worship opportunities that are not friendly to that population, then it's always going to be hard if you don't start with them first. And here's the thing: when you start with that group and consider them first and bring them to the table and ask them to help shape those things, it actually makes the whole church better for everyone.
Mm.
When we started doing some things differently, it actually made the church service run better. It made people more comfortable. They started inviting more friends, because we started with the group that we knew, if we're going to do this, let's have them in mind. A great example of a previous church is, we live in an age where we like the lights to be down. And I would tell them, no, I don't want the lights all the way down. In the wing section of the auditorium, leave the lights at 30%.
Mm.
Because that's where all our people, elderly people and people with disabilities sit there, because they don't want to come all the way down to the front. It's too far of a walk. And I don't want them to get hurt. And so instead of having a rock concert, leave those lights up because that's where they sit. And I want to make sure that our style of worship is not unintentionally excluding them. Another great example was, I know a church that used to do communion at night. And it was just a tradition. And I said that, but you're cutting out a whole population of elderly people who don't drive at night. And so now we're asking people to come to the Lord's table, but we're excluding people in the disability community who can't drive at night, who can't get out at night, and are probably not even having an opportunity to observe communion with their church family because of when we're doing it. So those are things that just consider. And if we start with them first, then we can build the church correctly. But if we don't, then Jesus tends to allude that we're building things backwards when we don't start with them first.
Yeah. Wow. Lamar, I want to, I want to honor your time. It's been great to
Mm,
talk to you. But one thing, for a final question, at the end of the book, you talk about all the work that the church is going to have to do in order to become a diverse place. And man, when I read that, I love that. And then I started to think of, wow, that that is a massive job to
yeah.
of everything it's going to take for the church to become this place of this kind of diversity. So where is, for anybody that's listening, I think you're going to have people who are watching this, they're listening to this, and they're in. This is you're really speaking to them here.
Mhm.
Um, where do they start? Where does that kind of work to become that diverse place? Where does it start? What is the very first step you think that the church ought to take?
Yeah, I think the best step, um, I would like it to be the first. It might not be the first depending on your context, but the best step and the one that you should fight hardest to make first is to put persons from the disability community in leadership in your church. And I
Mm,
mean real leadership, not token leadership. Um, I say this in the book, you can tell an organization's commitment to diversity by who it allows to lead. And so if it's truly something that the church is passionate about and you want to move forward in that area, you can't do it without having those persons in real leadership. Because a large part of the reason why we got ourselves in the mess that we're in is because church as we see it now and the way that most of us practice it, um, it was it was thought of and invented and created by all the same types of minds.
mm,
So anytime you get the same types of minds getting together and saying this is what church should look like, you automatically by default exclude those who don't think like you, don't have your experience. And the only way that the church is actually going to get better at this is to bring persons in from the disability community, give them real positions of leadership, and help them shape the future of what your church looks like. Because they're going to be the ones who give you the input on this is why we're not here. These are the things that are important to us. These are some of the real life struggles that we have. These are the barriers that we have to coming to church. So if you try to do it without them, and there's a saying in the disability community, nothing about us without us. And so
mm.
we can talk all day about how we want to reach the disability community, but if we're doing it without them at the table, it's only going to go so far. So I would say that's the first step. And again, you may already have some of those people in your congregation or on the periphery. Bring them to the table, appoint them to a special committee, give them real influence in the church, and listen to what they have to say about shaping the future of what your church should look like. And it's going to be a lot of hard work, but if you have I say this in the book, when their voice is absent, a void is present. And so we need them at the table to help us shape what the future of our churches should look like.
Yeah. Oh man, that's great. That's beautiful. Lamar, I know that people that are watching, listen, they're going to want to get in touch with you and connect with you. Where can people find you online?
Yeah, so the best place is to go to my website. It's autismpastor.com, because on there you can get all the links to my social media, even links to how to purchase my books where you can find those. But if you're just on social media and you want to link up with me on Twitter, it's autism at Autism Pastor, on Facebook, Autism Pastor, or my personal page, Lamar Hardwick. Um, or honestly, you can just Google me. I'm not hard to find these days, so I try to make myself as accessible as possible for individuals and churches who want to have this conversation or are serious about building the church the right way, so that we don't continue to exclude the disability community. So autismpastor.com, autism pastor, Google me. There's so many ways you can get to me, and I respond. I will respond to messages. So if you need anything, feel free to reach out.
Awesome. Awesome. We'll have links to all that in the show notes so people can find that really simple. And this has been great. Lamar, thanks so much for coming on the podcast, man. It's been awesome.
Man, thanks for having me. I enjoyed our discussion.